Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Biennial Conference Embracing Change and Transformation here in Aurora, Colorado, and virtually across our country. We have LGHN members all across the country, from Florida up to Washington, down to Arizona, and over to Michigan. So thank you for those of us joining online. Thank you for those of us joining in person. My name is Marcus Steele. I'm Finance Manager at the City of Mesa, Arizona. I am also the immediate past chair of the Mesa Hispanic Network. I was just elected to the board of LGHN as well. And today we're here to talk about a dynamic issue, a constantly evolving technological issue. We have two media professionals, one on the private sector side and one on the city management, city government side as well. We're going to introduce them in just a minute, but please have your questions. This is going to be more of a conversation. So if you have any questions about Spanish media, delivering messages, public messages to Spanish speaking audiences and communities, please have those questions ready for our folks. So first we're going to introduce our panel. Unfortunately, Clara could not join us this afternoon, but we do have two excellent professionals. Marisa Ramos Ramirez, who is a counterpart of mine at the City of Mesa, a dear friend, and one of the public sector, local government leaders in innovation in public information, social media use, and service delivery. Marisa, why don't you go ahead and give us an introduction of yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Marisa Ramirez Ramos. I work for the City of Mesa in Mesa, Arizona as a senior public information and communications specialist. This November, we'll be celebrating my 20th year of service with the City of Mesa. And I have worked in our Mesa Fire and Medical Department for 13 years. I've worked with our Parks and Rec Department for about 2.5 years, and been in our citywide PIO office for the last 3 to 4 years. So I've had the opportunity to go out and explore in several different city departments, but I'm really happy with the initiative and excited to share with you what we're doing with our Spanish language media in local government in Mesa.
Thank you, Marisa. Next, I'd like to introduce Mike Ferrufino, the president and CEO of the Denver Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Mike, why don't you tell us about yourself?
No, thank you. Thank you. Listen, thank you for having me. And it may feel a little atypical at the moment to have somebody basically that runs a Chamber of Commerce. However, before running the Chamber of Commerce, I spent the last, let's say, 30 years in Spanish language media, and primarily working in electronic broadcast formats, overseeing the operations of both television and radio, and then have really built up, I think, almost like a small, let's say, Spanish language advertising agency within the chamber to be able to help fill the gaps and help disseminate messages throughout the state. And I would say over the past 5 years or so, we probably ran about $10 million worth of media campaigns on that side. Also, with my involvement in Spanish language radio, part of that was from the ownership side. And so being a consummate entrepreneur, it allowed me to start a lot of businesses, and then having the media, and then really test a lot of messaging as well. So with that, I think we've been able to go through and kind of figure out a couple different formulas. And so really excited about being able to help provide a lot of the attendees what you would consider to be best practices in terms of being able to communicate with this diverse community.
Great, thank you. Mike, I want to start back with you. When we talk about Spanish language media, and when we talk about the Spanish speaking population, I'm going to ask you a really nebulous question because I know you have a powerful answer. What is the Spanish speaking market?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question to ask right now. And I think for a lot of us, we just had Census 2020 data come out. I, as well as many of my colleagues, are big believers that we are on the, crossroads of a massive multicultural economic revolution, with over 62 million Hispanics living in the United States, representing about $1.7 trillion of buying power. And to give people an idea, that is bigger than the entire Canadian economy. The U.S. Hispanic market is often referred to as a country within a country. If it was its own country, it would be the 8th largest economy in the world. So that just helps us understand, from a dollar perspective, which is, I think, an important piece to be able to connect the dots to sometimes, what the size of this is. Now, when you talk about the market, I think this is very important. One, we have a question of identity, how people choose to identify. Do they identify as being Hispanic, as Latino, as Latina, Chicano? What is their identity? Is it Mexican? Is it Argentine? The other piece is this understanding of ethnicity versus race, and then the other areas that I think are really critical are these, what we call maybe a degree basically of assimilation or acculturation. We like to look at this in 5 different categories, from a dominant Spanish speaking new arrival all the way down to basically very assimilated, very limited amount of Spanish. So I think understanding what these are and then who you're reaching is a very important piece in terms of understanding the different channels that you can use, the different messages, and the different messengers. So the size is going to be dependent upon every individual market. So, for instance, in Colorado, we've got about 22% of the population is Hispanic. And I will use the term Hispanic, just that's a term I feel comfortable with, but I also use that understanding that not everybody uses that term or will identify with that. Now, out of that 22% of the population, which is 1.2 million, that will actually lend itself to about 50% prefer to speak in Spanish, and another 50% prefer to be speaking English. Now, there's different ways to access this data. The census will go through and provide different data breaking down in terms of language or preferred language. But Claritas, Nielsen are also good data points to be able to utilize to be able to get a sense of what this looks like. So in Colorado's case, we're talking about 50% of the population will prefer, and that has been a challenge over this last, let's say, 18 months of COVID, in really making sure that there are the right messages. And I think it does put a lot of public information officers, it puts a lot of people in government all of a sudden, with a tremendous amount of responsibility in terms of trying to identify different types of strategies and tactics in terms of reaching these community members with the effectiveness, but also with the frequency and the urgency. That is another key piece too, to make sure that we're actually getting message penetration. So with that, I'm not sure if I answered your question entirely, but
No, you sure did. And I want to, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that.
Yeah,
So initially, when we created our Spanish outreach initiative, I was looking at data, nationally as well as locally. And we knew this would have an online component. So I'll share a few stats that I also have. 94% of online Hispanic adults, which would be 18 and over, are social media users. Hispanic consumers share content 5 times more often than their non-Hispanic counterparts. And of that content they share, it's 13% more likely to be clicked on by others on social media. 3 out of 4 Hispanics use Facebook regularly when they're online. And then locally, when I tried to fine tune, some of that larger data, 81% speak some Spanish in the Phoenix metro area. And Mesa is one of the surrounding cities around Phoenix, Arizona. So to me, that spoke volumes that we have 81% of our population in the Valley speaking some level of Spanish. That coupled also with the fact that we had almost 30% of our population in our city reporting as Hispanic. And then we also had various things happening within our education community. Our local school district, Mesa Public Schools, has a minority student population, with 42% of that being Hispanic. And then our local community college had just received their Hispanic Serving Institute. I guess it's like a designation. So that being that they serve at least 25% of their student population being Hispanic.
Great, thanks for that. And so when we're talking about data, Marisa and Micah, this is something that you and I had touched on when we met previously, was that although the census may say that X% of your population is Hispanic, that is kind of very broad and not very deep. And so what we need to do as professionals and as media professionals and as public professionals is understand the values behind that data, the cultural values, what the data gaps are, and some of the response biases of those individuals that are behind that, 30%, 40%. In Aurora, Colorado has just surpassed that it is a majority minority population. Can you fill us in, Mike, a little bit more about understanding what's behind that data and who is behind that data?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, like I said, I'm a big believer in as much empirical data as one can get your hands on. Now, but I also with that say, listen, it's a data point. That's it. So gather 3 data points, 4 data points. People will utilize, census, and this is the most accurate it's going to be. And we already know that it coming out is still have some gaps in it because of the challenges in terms of reaching hard to count populations. So, if the census has those challenges every single decennial census, on top of that, because of how politicized things were over this past year, in addition to that, with COVID, like we expect certain gaps, so I think part of that is saying now when we look at every other piece of data, whether it's Nielsen is the company that actually will go through and provide all the television ratings. They have also, over the past couple of years, absorbed Arbitron, which is the company that provides the radio ratings, but everybody's going to use the census data as a baseline. Now, you had talked about response bias. So I think on one side, as we go through and think about the baselines we have, the second thing is understanding like the response bias, that you're going to see with Hispanics overall. Hispanics overall have a very well-known response bias. They overwhelmingly are positive, okay, number one. And they are more positive the less assimilated they get. So the more Spanish speaking they become, the more positive they get in terms of response bias. So there are challenges with longitudinal studies, and it just, once again, that is a data point itself. So really having an ability to kind of interpret this stuff, from a local level, from a grassroots level, to make sure that you're pairing basically these kind of feelings, the hair on the back of your neck, along with these different data points to help kind of come up with a composite of what this community looks like. And that's what I think is important in terms of being able to start with and say, listen, if you have a population, for, let's say, the sake of easy math, 100,000 in a specifically, municipality, and, X percentage is supposed to be already previously identified as Hispanic, like, what does this look as you break it down a little further? And once you get an idea of what these buckets are, I think it's an important, then you have an idea of exactly, what the resource allocation, on top of proportional versus equitable versus information gaps, but also, the right messenger, the right medium, and the right message to be able to reach those individuals. So, as an example, I would say that we have seen, I think oftentimes, both large and small challenges being made, with the wrong messenger. We had a situation here where there was a Spanish language television station that years ago was launching their first news broadcast. They hired somebody that had a tremendous amount of general market experience, worked for ABC and NBC, came into market. Now unbeknownst to them, this gentleman had never worked in Spanish language media, although he was Hispanic. He ended up finding some great talent, trained him. The guy was a star to begin with, threw him on air the first night. In Denver is in the Denver DMA, which is almost like an MSA, but it's about 2/3 of the state, it's a primarily like 85% Mexican market, and primarily Northern Mexican in terms of the Spanish speaking audience. So the gentleman who was from Cuba had a very noticeable Cuban accent, and then shortly after that, 3 weeks, both the talent and the news director were gone, because it just was the wrong fit. So I think we see even big mistakes from seasoned organizations, who sometimes should know better, but it just kind of lends itself to this challenge of when we look at data, how do we look at it? What lens do we look at it through? And then not over depending upon one data point, but really collecting as much as we can, and then starting out, I think, with at least a baseline of what this community looks like. Now, we talked about the numbers and how big the population is now, but then we also think about what the role is of the future. And we see a massive, massive group of Hispanics and Latinos that are under the age of 18. So we're going to see a mass amount of growth. And with that growth, we're going to see new groups pop up that are greater amounts of, almost bilingual, and bicultural, and will consume different types of media and will require different channels. And when I say channel, that is just, basically, let's say, a way to reach them, to reach them effectively. So that's where I think part of it is important in terms of the data, is really thinking through, one, making sure that you have a baseline. Two, taking what kind of data you can from a local level and layer that on top of different national data, census data, Nielsen data, Claritas data, Scarborough, Pew, CELIG, so there's a lot of data sources out there. And once you start layering them up, you're going to get a better idea of exactly what that census tract looks like. And then when you start launching different types of local data projects, just making sure that you take into account the response bias, you equate for, different types of, assimilation, and you weight appropriately. If the census is already saying you have X percentage of the population speaking Spanish, and you only collect responses from a very small percent, you're going to have to upweight them or downweight them.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And just to comment personally on that, the response bias of the Hispanic population, I always envisioned my grandfather, who's 94 years old, and in, as good of health as a 94-year-old is, walking into his doctor's office, his doctor asks him how he's doing. He says, great. It's like, no, Grandpa, you got to tell him about your leg hurting and your left arm hurting. And no, it's fine. It's good. Everything's fine. And so when we talk about that response bias in the Hispanic population, I'm always envisioning my grandparents talking to their doctor, and they're always going to respond positively with good messages and good things, because that's just that generation and that's that culture. I want to turn it over to Marisa to tell us about what I am most proud of and having to do very little with, if anything, which is the Facebook in Espanol initiative that the city of Mesa began 3 years ago, spearheaded by Marisa. Give us a background on the program, Marisa, and then tell us the successes we've had.
Sure. So in 2014, the city of Mesa had their first Hispanic council member elected. At the time, 2014, not that many years ago, I was over at the fire department working in public information, and I was asked at the time to move over to the council office and work, as Councilmember Luna's assistant. So after working there for a while, I was presented with the opportunity to work on a special assignment to do some research and propose what would be the opportunity that the city of Mesa had to somehow digitally outreach with the Hispanic population that we have. So with some of the statistics that I presented just a little while ago, I did my research. At the time, I was also getting my master's in communication, so it fit right in with everything that I was learning at the time. But I presented to our city management that we should bring on, just like we have offered for quite some time, social media and digital offerings to our English-speaking population, we need to have that opportunity as well in Spanish. I had a great colleague in the city of Reno, Nevada, reached out to her because I knew they were doing similar and like-minded initiative at the time. And we kind of, put our heads together, and I learned from what they had done, the mistakes and pitfalls that they had, so that I could put our program together. Thankfully, our city has a certification program. So when employees are bilingual, you actually test so that you can have additional pay added on, as an incentive to your paycheck. We have a basic level and we have an intermediate level. So I asked for the list from HR of all of our intermediate Spanish speakers at the time. And then I went to the department directors meeting and I presented to them and I said, please nominate out of your departments when you see this list of Spanish speakers that you have, 1 to 2 people that, could be your department representatives. So from there, we formed a team of about 20 different people. And these could be anywhere from a box office, front desk person who actually sells the tickets to our art center. It could be someone working in museums doing education, or a neighborhood outreach specialist. So I had a team that wasn't really comm professionals. They didn't know about communication, but we quickly got all the tools together that we needed. I provided training to the team of 20 people. We launched our Facebook page in 2018, and we're still in existence, today. And I really think that having that relationship with our community, we work really hard to get information out just as timely as it is on the English speaking social media platforms over to our Spanish page so that information is disseminated equally to our residents. In going through the process, we also realized, we don't even have an email address where our residents can email. A lot of local governments have info at, your local government webpage, and we said, we need an email address. Why do we have info@mesaaz.gov? That might not be very inviting, but if we had preguntas@mesaaz.gov, then that person automatically knows just from typing in the email address, oh, I can probably speak in Spanish to this person that's on the other side. So we field emails that come in, regularly on construction permits, and I want to build something, or I have a code issue that's going on in my neighborhood. And we field those out to the contacts that we have in the different departments. And then we also built a hub. So our webpage is, it does have a translation feature, but we wanted to have one page that was specific for our Spanish language audience. So it has all of the contacts that we have citywide on that bilingual list. So they can go through and they can see if I'm looking for a certain department, I have a certain question or need, they can go to that page, they can find the contact, they could email or call them directly, versus what we were hearing a lot is that people just call somewhere in the city, and then they get bounced around a lot. They're just trying to find someone that could speak to them in their language. So it kind of evolved from, let's start with this Facebook platform, let's get information out. Then we realized maybe we need email attached to that as well. We need to have an established hub on our webpage. And then I really like what you said, Mike, as well. We're going to have to keep evolving. And as we see with social media specifically, it changes so often and so quickly. We have the plan and we'd like to, it's just getting the manpower, but Instagram is definitely a space where you're talking about that younger generation and that are definitely more bilingual and can communicate seamlessly in both languages. That is a place that we'd like to venture out to next, so we know the audience that we have is a more middle-aged audience on Facebook. We know that we have 70% of women, 30% of men. So it's really interesting to be able to glean that data, know who we're talking to. But I think that the thing that we do so well is that our regular city social media sites tend to be very government and very, here is the message and we're sending you out this information. What we really do try to do with the Spanish site is break that down, and we show our employees as much as possible. We create videos, we're in the videos, we feature our council members all the time because we want them to know the real faces that are behind local government, so that if they come into the building, if they talk to us on the phone, they can probably think back and go, oh, I saw that person on a video. I remember her speaking, so we really try to form just that relationship that is a lot more personal, that makes a lot more sense to us culturally. And I think the benefit of that is, it was very in our face during COVID. Had we not started this initiative in 2018, had we not been building our audience, making relationship, comments come in and we try to reply back very timely. But had we not done all of that, in the middle of a crisis is not the time to be trying to create accounts to distribute information. We don't have a user base that's built in, but because we had a couple of years under our belt when COVID hit, we knew how to create videos. We knew how to live stream and get our council members on there immediately to talk to our audience and let them know what was happening. So for us, it was very seamless to duplicate anything that the mayor was issuing information on our English side, having one of our 2 council members be able to do the same thing on our Spanish side.
Great, thanks, Marisa. As a finance professional, one of the things that makes so much sense about the story, about the vision that you, alongside Councilmember Luna and others in the city of Mesa, created, is it doesn't cost a single penny to create a Facebook page. It costs a single penny to create an preguntas@mesaaz.gov. It takes current resources that we already have. It just takes a little bit of that leadership investment in our staff, provide leadership opportunities to help lead this. And I know that you've been at the city for a long time, but whenever I look at you, I look at Mesa en Español, and I think that is just, there's not a lot of people in the city, myself included, who sit behind the scenes, but you actually provide that messaging along with your counterparts on the Mesa en Español board. I think it's a beautifully simple thing that any municipality, no matter what location or demographic, can do. So I want to go into an idea that I was introduced to in preparation for this session, about going beyond translation from English to Spanish and really transcreating what the message is. It makes a lot of sense on paper, and there's some legal things, as we all know, that when we take a resolution or a council ordinance, that we do have to do it professionally word by word. But when we're trying to talk about things about our home program or CDBG programs, or how rental assistance programs or food box assistance programs, or even our parks and recreation programs, that we need to actually recreate, not just translate, but transcreate that message. Mike, in your background, can you give us a little bit more background on that and elaborate on that, Mike, please?
Absolutely. So the transcreation, and I'll start by saying, I will get back to transcreation in one moment. But you said something that I wanted to touch on as well, that's part of this entire process. And I will tell you that we do a lot of consulting for, different Fortune 500 companies, different massive, ballot initiatives, political campaigns, in terms of helping to try to go through, and we'll do everything from the media buying to the message to the creative strategy and everything in between. So in regard to COVID, there was a major metro mayor, not in Colorado, that was asking for some help, and tried to let them know that, one, we don't have a playbook on how this is all going to work, right? I can't tell you definitively, and this is at the beginning, this was maybe last November, in terms of what vaccine uptake and what the message is going to be and need to be and everything else, because this is unprecedented. We've never dealt with this before, okay? But I can tell you that there is a playbook on how not to do this, okay? And the playbook on how not to do this, is very deep, because there are consumer brands that are spending hundreds of millions of dollars every single year trying to reach a dominant Spanish-speaking consumer, okay? So, number one is that, yes, you've got to go through and not just translate, okay? You have got to make sure that you transcreate a message, meaning that you're able to kind of take the general spirit of what is happening, within one message, and then make sure that it is culturally appropriate and from a language perspective, for another specific subgroup. And there are many examples of massive mistakes, that we see this happen. The example I mentioned basically with the news anchor personality, is a very subtle, but nevertheless, kind of appropriate example of this inability to understand, transcreation, even from that perspective. Right. So that is a critical piece in terms of being able to go through. The other piece that I also want to kind of touch on really quickly is that is that there is nothing that will substitute. There's no magic silver bullet, right? And as much as I want to applaud everybody's efforts in terms of being able to reach out via Facebook and reach out via social media, I think part of the challenge too is saying that, social media has kind of democratized the way we're able to kind of approach advertising and communication. Now, that's great on one side. It's bad on the other because everybody thinks they're now like a social media advertising expert. And I've seen a lot of money go into nonprofits, this past year and a half that aren't equipped with the tools, the understanding, to be able to go through and craft messages, with the urgency or the frequency necessary, despite being able to boost a Facebook post, and really understand how to do this. Like social media is a very complicated medium as well. You can either do it really well or you can't, just like advertising on Univision or Telemundo or any of the radio stations, remember. But I think the important piece is making sure that there is a general understanding that we do need to kind of move past this ability of saying, we're going to just go through and put something up on Facebook, or we're just going to get something translated or transcreated and get it on the website. That's not enough. We need to put money behind this because as big as the market that consumes Facebook is, it's not going to go anywhere, if you're not actually putting some fuel behind it. And to put the right fuel in the right spot becomes expensive. All advertising is broken down to a very basic principle of cost per thousand or cost per point, and so there's no great way around this, and when you look, if you have a Univision in your local market, 50% of the revenue is from blue chip companies that get it. This is how you're going to reach these, this specific target market. The other 50% is coming from local Hispanic-owned businesses that understand this is the way you want to reach too. So it's a combination of saying we need an omni-channel campaign to effectively reach these markets. It's not one or the other. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a combination of making sure that the right mediums are utilized in unison and in harmony in what I would consider an omni-channel campaign with the right amount of reach, saying that if you have a market and you're in Chicago, like that's a massive market. Okay, Texas, any of the Texas mountain, massive, right? So it's like making a nice, strong, thick drink, that if you think about if you're going to make a Cuba Libre and you think about the rum, the rum is going to be the budget you have to be able to go through. The Coke is going to be the audience. If you put a shot of rum and a gallon of Coke, you're not going to be able to taste the rum. You want to make sure that there is the right proportion, and that is the frequency. So it needs to be a frequency of 3 to 6 to make sure that we are effectively reaching. Now, I think making sure that there's opportunities for people to participate is critical, but I also think making sure that there is the necessary resources, to be able to reach this audience effectively is a really key piece. And as we are on the cusp of making sure that we're going to have once in a lifetime generational dollars to kind of put to use for our various municipalities, it's really making sure that I think the communication teams in these various municipalities, number one, have the resources, to build up a team and put money behind an infrastructure to make sure that they have a way to effectively, reach, what is definitely oftentimes an underserved community. And I will highlight really quickly too, that if we began, if all of us had the opportunity to go through and say, listen, we were going to go through and work for the SBA again, and, and let's figure out how we do PPP. Would we do it the same way? If we know that 50% of small businesses don't have a relationship with the traditional bank, would we have done PPP the same way? And the answer is, it's an easy no. If we know that in a dominant Spanish-speaking population, we already basically pre-COVID have challenges with health literacy, it's a question of saying, how much more are we going to have to spend or communicate with to make sure we are helping people understand the importance of everything from social distancing to mask wearing to the value of the vaccines, and it's going to be more than the journal market. And it's not just earned media, but it's really thinking about how we're able to create, the resources available to make sure that we have enough reach and frequency. That is the key with any type of marketing or advertising. The second is making sure that we have the right message. And this is what, the transcreation kind of comes in, saying, are we taking a message that is just from a, English language advertising agency that has no experience in multicultural? And it's not just a quick translation. It's making sure that that message is going to emotionally resonate with the individuals. Like, number one, it's great to have a message. Number two, it's important to understand all messages are not alike. Like, we are bombarded with commercial announcements. I think the last time I read, it's like over 4,000, commercial messages per day. We never thought it was going to be that high. So the question is, how do you cut through the clutter? Well, even if you have the ability to get the message to the right individual, the next piece is making sure that you have a message that cuts through the clutter, and reaches somebody and basically has them feeling like, this is for me. That is an effective message, And then the last piece is really making sure that who's delivering the message. What messenger is delivering the message, and is it somebody that actually will go through and help support or not? And then at the end of it is, what is the call to action? What do you want them to do? Do you want them to go to a Facebook page? Do you want them to basically go through? Do you want them to sign? So then it's understanding, like, how are we going to make it easier for engagement? Are there text message elements involved? We understand, like I said, like not everybody has an email address. We've learned a lot through these times, but I think it still comes down to a very basic, fundamental marketing, about reach and frequency, about message, which you have talked about in terms of this idea of transcreation, where it just has to be more than translation, and then a question of like the messenger and then the call to action.
Great, thank you, Mike. Did you have a success story you'd like to share in that transcreation, Marisa, that you'd like to share?
Well,
with
yeah,
the City of Mesa?
I want to touch on a few different things that
Please.
Mike brought up and struck a chord with me. So when he was talking a lot about, making sure you have the right, outreach for the community. We know that when we're running the Facebook and Espanol page, we can't, as any marketing campaign would, it needs to be multifaceted. So we can't depend only on the online digital aspect. One of the things that our team prides ourselves in is that as a team, we go out in the community every time there's an opportunity to interact with the public in person. We're at groundbreakings, we're at ribbon cuttings for, different parks and things in our community, especially when they are in the districts that we know our target audience, lives in. So we go out all the time. We do booths and tables, and we talk about how you can better communicate with, us as local government. And I think that's a unique part of it as well, is that we're not just relying on the digital aspect, thinking that everyone's going to come online. We know that oftentimes our Spanish speakers just walk into an office and they're there and they need help, and they're probably, at the utilities building when they really are coming to ask something about, getting a permit. So we go out into the community, and I think that's a crucial point that you brought up, making sure you have the right, multifaceted delivery to the audience, and the resources. I'm so glad to hear that coming from you. Obviously, you're dealing with businesses that have, a budget that's going to far exceed what we have in local government, but that has been something that, yes, that I would say has been one of the struggles for us, because we are in local government, helping understand that digital media, what the reach that we're going to have organically is very different than when we're running paid advertising from the page. I can tell you on average, an organic post on our page is going to have, an impression or a reach of anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000, people of our followers that we're interacting with. When we ran paid advertising during COVID, whether it was for our food bank distributions, our vaccination clinics that our fire department was holding in our convention center, it was over a million in reach. So to be able to have that data and then present it to, our council, to our city management, and say, this is what we're doing organically, but if you give us even just a little bit of money, $500, $1,000, this is the wonders that we can work, reaching further out into the community. And then moving into the translation versus transcreation, we had a change in our communications director. So our incoming director is Venezuelan, and she is really helping our team. I think that change in leadership just has made such a difference. And she was, the one that really pointed out to us, but what we're doing, is it translation or is it transcreation? And, for the most part, when we started off, I think we were just translating. We were taking the information because this is what was being given to us from other departments. And we just were like, okay, this is the information we need to get out. So the example that she shared with us and really hit home, when we were talking about recycling, because our recycling here, has taken a lot of hits and a lot of changes in what we're able to recycle for local government, and how we're trying to message to our residents what they can actually put into the recycling bins. And she said, okay, when we're talking about it though, from a cultural standpoint, we have all sorts of different members, whether it's Puerto Ricans, Venezuelan, Mexicans, whatever we have a diverse group. And she said, what do you all think of? And we're like, okay, it's like, do you think of opening the fridge and you have like 20 different containers in there? They're not really Tupperware, but it's the butter container, it's the country crock. But only one of them really has butter, because one has frijoles, one has menudo, they all have something else, because we keep those containers, we clean them out, and then we recycle them to use them as Tupperware. And she said, the other thing you can think about too, think about when you have like around Christmas time, those metal tin boxes and little like coffee cookies, come in them. She's like, what does that make you think of? And right away, I'm like, oh, my Nana had one of those, but it didn't have cookies in it. It had, all her sewing supplies. It had, threads and needles and, all her safety pins and things like that. And she's like, exactly, when we position the recycling video, we can't position it the same way that we're positioning it to the rest of our community. But if we brought in some of those elements that you all just, are thinking of for recycling, that's what I'm talking about, transcreation, and really hitting home with the audience. So that was kind of the light bulb for us of what the difference between the two is.
Great, thank you. So we have at least one city manager in the hall and several aspiring city leaders there. Mike, what would you share for a city leader in the majority or near majority Hispanic speaking population that we as public professionals could do better? And what are the one or two tools that you would suggest using in order to reach those audiences for critical services, for critical responses and the like?
Yeah, well, and I would first say that please, like I'm a big believer in this. So if anybody needs help in the future in terms of helping to put together, some type of deck in terms of making some type of overture to a city council in terms of, like seeking the necessary resources, I have no problem helping, support that effort. I think this is really critical. So I think one is just really making sure, I think that, that there is kind of this challenge, I think, and I've seen this over 30 years, and I'll say that, even in LA, where you had a dominant Univision and Telemundo compared to the ABC, NBC, and CBS and Fox outlets, they were getting less per spot, although they reached more people, because oftentimes they weren't seeing value in themselves. That was one. And they weren't holding a specific rate integrity. And then two, the other organizations would come at them and say, listen, we're only going to use one of you, give us the best deal. So they would kind of battle with each other. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they were getting less per spot, although they should have gotten more than their general market counterparts. So this kind of, has this general idea about, about being like bold enough to really kind of go through and say, we need the resources necessary to be able to reach, if I have, if 25% of my city is Hispanic, and let's say it's 70%, according to census data, like prefer to speak Spanish, like that's a substantial population that I need to be able to go through and create channels of communication, right? And I think one is going through and saying, everybody understands, I think peripherally, this question about like political campaigns, in any state in this country, can we elect a governor by just, without television? And the answer is no. Like electronic broadcast media plays such a strong role in being able to convey a message. All these other things are critical: the phone calls, the mail, the door knocks, social media. But still, at the end of the day, if you don't have a budget for advertising that is going to depend upon electronic broadcast, you're not going to win. So it just gets us back to this idea of this is not really it's not direct response, right? We can't look at it like we're running an ad, trying to sell some magical grill at 2:00 in the morning, and we're going to determine effectiveness on one day. This is a constant process of being able to go through and build up a relationship with various community members and trust, and not only figure out ways to get information out to them, but also figure out ways to get feedback back and making them feel comfortable. Because there is a concern about participation and about voice. And I think at the end of the day, we have a much smaller representation in terms of voice, from some of our vulnerable, from our Spanish speakers. So I think radio is a great way. I think having a radio program, finding a local radio station to be able to communicate to, because remember, depending upon the size of the market, it's very easy to kind of get a sense of what the reach is. So in Denver, that remember, if you run one 30-second commercial, on either Univision or Telemundo, you're going to reach about 15,000 people. One commercial, that's it, 15,000 people, okay? Every time you run it. Versus the three of us going down to Kinko's and making a bunch of flyers and paying a bunch of people to hand them out at grocery stores and at the churches. Sure, we can do that, but it's not going to be effective at the end of the day. And it's actually going to be more expensive in the long run. Because like I said, there's no magic, right? We create this word of mouth and we create this, and anything you do organically on social media is great. But then again, too, you need it distributed. So I think radio program and finding a way to reach out to your local radio station to figure out a way to do something monthly, to do something weekly, helps kind of build, a relationship with the specific audience. But even more importantly, it helps to build a relationship with alphas within those communities, in terms of trust and different delivers of messages. That when we go through and kind of map the sphere of influence, we have all the traditional ones where we go through and say, and especially too with vaccine uptake, it's sure, doctors and priests and, but it's really a question is it your doctor? How trusted are doctors from health systems? Is there still some concern? If it's not your priest, what does that do? But, we have found a lot of times too, it's kind of reaching in and saying, we've got all these radio DJs. These radio DJs, every time they open up the mic, they're reaching 5,000 people every single time. A lot of these small radio stations are reaching 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100,000 people a week. What nonprofit would we not want to partner with that reaches 100,000 people a week, every week? Okay. I don't know any local Hispanic nonprofits that do that. They don't even reach 100,000 people a year. So that is the power of the frequency, and then too, you've got these DJs that are like superstars. Remember, in the dominant Spanish speaking world, it's not like connecting with the MLS. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but the MLS soccer, it falls on number 4 in terms of priority, right below your kids, varsity high school team. So remember, their soccer stars are back in Mexico, are playing, on the European professional teams. It's not at the MLS a lot of times, with the exception of Chicharito, and there's a few others that basically are around. But that just gives you an idea. We don't have a lot of these local, even national celebrities that we can tap into, but we've got these local radio DJs. Use them. Ask them to partner with you. That's number 1. 2, we have a lot of musical stars, national and local and regional. Their following and their influence. We've got business owners that are also alphas in their communities. When we think about the African-American community and we talk about the role of the barbershop, there are these stores and these businesses that do provide a great amount of more than just a place where I'm going to go buy my, stop by the panderia. They play a more crucial role. So part of it's mapping this sphere of influence, but at the end of the day, having something on the radio side, helps support everything you're doing in social media in terms of drawing people there, building up, because there is a value of saying, how do we build up and how do we kind of like, and I use the term commercialize just from a sense of that, in consumer marketing, but it's saying like, as we go through, like everything counts, right? Like how many cell phone numbers can I get? How many people like page likes can I get? How many email addresses can I get? Like how much? Because at the end of the day, if I start with a Facebook page and I've got 5,000 now and 10,000, like at some point, hopefully I've got 250,000. And when I've got 250,000, where I've got a substantial amount of penetration in that community, like then, my ability to utilize that channel, really cost efficiently is magical. But if I've only got a couple thousand, then I'm still searching, right? I just don't have the critical mass at that point. So it's using these things in partnership to start build your lists. And the bigger your lists get, the more effectively you can push out information, via text. Text message is another wonderful way of combining that with nice, response and message delivery and everything else with social media and radio, because TV gets really expensive. So those are what I would suggest for city managers. And the other thing too is just kind of like do a baseline, like have your city demographer, have somebody kind of go through, give you a baseline of what this market looks like, try to break it down a little bit more clearly to understand, what part of your Hispanic community is assimilated, and acculturated, like breaking it down in a couple different buckets. It doesn't have to be 5 like we do it, but it could be 3. It could be English dominant, Spanish dominant, and then more bilingual. Get a sense of where the countries of origin are from. So you've got a sense too. You can't be everything to anybody. And the other thing too is that I'll give you an idea. The city of Denver, at the beginning of COVID, they were translating things into 13 different languages, but it would take 2 to 3 weeks for the translations to be done, and they were just translations. They were not transcreations. It was just translation, and as much as I applauded the effort in terms of being able to go through and do that, part of it was at the end of the day is sometimes by being too inclusive, we are actually being inequitable. And so at the end of the day, the 3 languages that Denver needs to kick off day one is English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. Now, Vietnamese, not because that population is the biggest Asian population, but if you look at data, it is the population that has the least amount, of English accessibility, compared to the other Asian populations. So that is where that becomes really critical. So I think part of it is just kind of like helping to gather the data and understanding the data is a data point. How do you supplement that with some additional information to give you a little bit more, of an idea of the segmentation of your Hispanic community, taking that information, which is statistical, how do we go past that and layer on psychographic data, which are going to be a little bit more the opinions, the attitudes, the interests, the lifestyles. When we talked about the recycling, that's exactly what that is. That's psychographic data, and then you layer that on in terms of more like value graphic data. So you're getting a 3D perspective of this resident, right? Not just a single, basically they're Hispanic. Now it's kind of a little bit more of a 3D. And the more you understand this 3D look of that specific resident, the better you're going to be able to start thinking about different channels and where your resources need to go or not go to be able to reach them based upon, I think, a lot of the gaps that we all know better than ever exist.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Marisa, any word of advice for city managers or aspiring city managers out there?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned before, identifying your Spanish speakers and having them go through some sort of a process, because we all know that just because someone maybe speaks the language, they might not be able to write the language. So the fact that we had a list where we had our beginner level, but we had our intermediate who we knew also not only spoke it, but had tested out of a written portion as well, providing them training. Not everyone feels comfortable in front of a camera. So being able to have the group come together, get some training from our public information office, put them in a simulated, training where they're in front of a camera. They have to talk on whatever subject matter, is important to their department, so that they get that experience, so that the first time they're doing it isn't when they're live on camera, with Telemundo or Univision. They've had some kind of simulated practice beforehand. And then really, I want to touch on what you said, knowing when to pitch it to, our media counterparts. We are fortunate enough that our arts and culture department has a running segment every Friday, Rincón Cultural, with I think it's Telemundo. And, we have to know what to pitch to them that's going to make sense, because we also don't want to pitch it to our Spanish speaking audience and then they come to whatever this event is or thing we're inviting them to, and we don't have it bilingually accessible. So recently we had a new exhibit in one of the museums, but that was the first time an exhibit in our museum was going to be bilingual. So all the placards that you read and talks about the artist and tells you there's an interactive activity at this point, you can do this interactivity with your child, but everything was translated in English and in Spanish. Now that made sense for us to really hit the media hard, our Spanish counterparts, and say, help us promote this, because this is the first time it's being done. We really want to draw this audience into our children's museum to have this experience with their child, but we are ready for it as well. We've made it accessible, and we have staff that will be there that are able to communicate in, Spanish with our residents. So.
Great, thank you, Marisa. Are there any, I didn't see any questions online. Did we have any questions in the audience? Noel? Sure, this is the city manager of Brownsville, Texas. We're getting them a mic right now.
Yeah, hi, this is Noel, City of Brownsville in South Texas. Mike, a lot of what you said was resonating with me. What was interesting over in Brownsville is it's a city of almost 200,000 population, 93% Hispanic, and it's a border city. So it creates additional challenges and nuances to the communication piece. But so surprisingly, we did not have a communications department when I got there, and it was a major sticking point to our governing body. But so our director came down from the Austin area, is from Laredo, and has border experience. And he's just beginning to build up this baseline data that you're talking about. But you kind of unpacked a more, I guess, almost more sophisticated marketing approach, right? That even in organizations that I've been at, where like in Dallas, where I was, we had 20% South and East Asians moving into the community. When I was in Taylor, it was more diverse between African American and Hispanic. But I haven't seen, and with the exception of Mesa and others, but I think there's islands of excellence or bright spots in some cities. But across the board, I've not seen that we take this type of marketing approach to really take that nuanced step. So you gave a very prescriptive kind of thought process of how you would go right about studying your market and who's the messenger, on and on and on. Is that something that, for example, us at LGHN, that you feel that we can create some type of best practice around, where we can help our predominantly Hispanic communities to make it almost easy to not so much be prescriptive to the point of having a playbook, because you mentioned that there is not a playbook for how you do it, it's how to not screw up. But I think it's just a recognition and the respect and appreciation to the marketing aspects of how you build your communication strategy, especially in a predominantly Hispanic community, because it's like a whole new dimension of communications that you just unpacked. I thought it was a very interesting way, while you are doing it on the ground, right? But I think here in Denver, with the size of your population and stuff like that. So what's your thought there? And is that something that you feel would add value to, let's say, our member cities?
Yeah, I do. And I would, please let me know. I'd love to volunteer to help do that, but to be able to help put together a toolkit and help provide, I think, maybe the data in terms of selling it in, to a municipality or a community about, what needs to be done or what areas to start, and, creating a little bit more of a template at some point, just with, helping source some of the data initially. And, and it's a little bit more of a step-by-step process. And I 100%, I think it's critical. And I think it's really important, for us to think about how we do this, especially what we've seen this last year and a half. And so I appreciate your comments and would be more than willing to, help do what I can and really pull in maybe some of my additional peers from, from other areas too. Like there are some fantastic corporate partners and agencies that I think would be more than willing to help as well, in terms of provide, this type of, understanding and just resources, because I think you're right. There is a different role that we're seeing people kind of coming into, especially within this last year and a half, and really trying to push the envelope a little bit differently. So as it was previously mentioned too about, the Jones Museum in Mesa, we're having the entire, Denver Art Museum has been bilingual, which I think is fantastic, and the zoo did this 15 years ago, right? Where and part of it was database decisions, right? And, so I think there are great case studies in terms of success. And the reason why I started out with the numbers is because people listen to the numbers first, right? And so when we talk about, the $2.6 trillion GDP, making, the 8th largest economy in the world, you're able to get people's attention. And so now when they think about the request for dollars to be able to kind of go through, or the need to be able to communicate, or understanding what the gaps and disparities are in terms of communication, now we're able to kind of go through. But I think part of the challenge has been is that we know that Hispanics are not a monolithic, group of individuals. There's a tremendous amount of diversity within our own groups. And there's also too, we still have yet to kind of unpack our own, implicit and explicit bias, and the discrimination we put each other through based upon immigration status, skin color, all kinds of things. But that is part of this overall challenge of trying to figure out different ways to effectively communicate. And so on one side, I feel like there's an absolute obligation for us to try to do better, and to make sure it works and make sure, and so I'm very, adamant about making sure that city and states have the resources and provide basically the political cover. So it's not necessarily that individual, but there's somebody else coming in and helping, to provide a little bit more of a push, to just make sure the departments, are prepared, and I'm a big believer too, that just because somebody's Hispanic doesn't guarantee they're a great advocate for Hispanics, and you don't have to be Hispanic to be a good advocate for Hispanics. Part of it though is understanding, the markets, the segmentation, the channels, and the techniques in terms of being able to go through and do this effectively, and then having the will and wanting to do it. So, and there are a tremendous amount of, I think, of examples, but I would be more than willing to really help the group and whatever be necessary in the future to help kind of take those steps necessary to provide some, some data and some best practices and some, some steps forward in terms of easy things to do that are both like close to free or absolutely free, and then as, the need, but it's not without understanding the need for the resources. Like I joke around and we'll talk to, like whether it's Senator Michael Bennett or, Senator Hickenlooper, or even Secretary Javier Becerra, we can't do this, with duct tape and bubble gum. Right. With this limited, we're so used to not valuing ourselves and also our community and how large and important this community is, that sometimes we're willing to, the same reason why we're willing to kind of recycle every butter, plastic container, and we think about things, we're very efficient, right? And it's at some point, there was an organization that got, I think, $1 million, to help start immigrant, entrepreneurs. And after 3 years, they've got 36 people through the program and they started one business. And at some point I was like, how do you do that? Right? Give somebody $500 a Costco card and help them fill out the paperwork and they're in business tomorrow, just about, so, there is a great amount of efficiency and creativity, I think, and, fortitude and, and willingness to kind of push through that all of us kind of culturally have. But I think too, we also need to make sure that we're good enough about asking for the necessary resources and start building up, a runway to make sure that the departments we leave behind, the city councils we leave behind, the cities we leave behind, have the necessary resources, the infrastructure to continue to communicate with the population, that with the right economic argument, you can easily connect the dots and say a substantial amount of every future employee, workforce, small business owner and voter is going to be in large part Hispanic. So it's really important for us to make sure that we are building a community for its short-term economic development and long-term economic development, success, by being very inclusive about having different ways to communicate with these different individuals.
Great, thank you, Mike. There any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. And this is Diana from the city of Tallahassee. And it's not so much a question, but a side note. And when you were all talking about transcreation, I always thought about it as, translation and interpretation. Interpretation, I guess, comes closer to that transcreation. But I feel like this term of transcreation, it's first time I'm hearing it, but I think it really captures what needs to be done. And it happens to me all the time. I read things in Spanish. I am fluent, and I could tell that it does not mean what it was intended to say in English. So it's just translating, and you lose the intent and the significance. So I think that's really important. And when you were talking about this, it reminded me of a trip I made to Colombia not too long ago, and I heard this little girl singing the Frozen song, and the same tune, but of course in Spanish. And it caught my attention because it was not the same, it wasn't translated. So it was very different words. So I was trying to find out why it was it seemed like a totally different song to me. And then I realized, no, it's really capturing the essence in Spanish. That's exactly what Disney was doing, I'm assuming, really transcreation there. If you get a chance to actually listen to both songs, it's not translated at all. It's literally just kind of getting the spirit of the song and what it was intended to make you feel. And so I think that's a perfect example. And just the last thing would be thinking about what Disney does with its movies. I don't think there's any harm in looking at the private sector. The purchasing power of Hispanics is in the trillions, 1.something trillion. And the private sector has been going after this for a while, and they may be doing a better job than government in some instances. So maybe looking at those companies in this example, like Disney, and kind of grabbing some of that model and what they're doing, and maybe adopting it to what we do.
Thank you, Diana. Are you going to sing it? Do you remember what the words were? Déjalo, déjalo, or something like that?
It's actually
Libre so. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think that there's, in terms of this idea of transcreation, I think who's a Money Heist fan, right? I mean, that's an easy way to start out, basically, with that on the front page of your PowerPoint, in terms of the need for that. There's a reason why they didn't use the original title, in Spanish, for that. The other one is the McDonald's campaign in terms of I'm loving it, right? In Spanish, me encanta. So there is this kind of idea in terms of really thinking about how we use words and how important it is just to find something that fits, and it's not a direct translation oftentimes. And translation too, to the point of making sure your actual governmental translation is done. Just because somebody speaks Spanish doesn't mean that they can translate, and really making sure that is a whole area that is unique itself. To make sure that something basically is ready for outreach. And then there's another piece too, of saying, as we kind of go through this transcreation side, it's part of it, but it's also thinking about, language within kind of the vernacular, that if you're trying to reach, an audience, that has, take into account, the education levels, their degree of understanding, and then thinking through basically the language and words you use too, which is not purely like a transcreation. It's more of almost like a translation element, but it's about language usage. So anyways, with that,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to our virtual audience. We appreciate you joining us, our in-person audience. Thank you very much. Marisa, always a pleasure. And Mike, very nice to hear you speak to us today. On behalf of LGH and to everybody, thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.